Hi, my name is Anh Nguyễn. I'm a Vietnamese photographer based in Brooklyn. I'm originally from Saigon and I've lived away from home in the US for about 10 years now. My photography work deals with kind of interpreting traditions and rituals in my culture outside of its original context and a lot of things around food. A lot of the works that I have seen or feel inspired by having to do with like Asian identity always has to do with community and the feeling of belonging that you can find in community. I started photographing and I was like, I noticed that there's a sense of like coldness in the way I see things. And I didn't really understand what that was until I kind of looked at it more deeply and I realized it was just like even when you're in a community, I think you can still feel a sense of like alienation. And that doesn't just come from any particular members of the community, but it's more the sense of like, in a way, it's not really your choice. Like a community is labeled that from like circumstances or from outsiders. So I do think that like when you are part of a community, there's this feeling that you can get of like, am I really part of this community, even if I feel a little different? And obviously, like at the end of the day, those differences is what makes a community so special, that it's not homogenous. But I do think that like what I feel inspired by is that specific feeling of like you could be a part of something and still feel like it's not right for you, or it's like there's like nuances to you how you experience belonging. When I started the Kitchen God series, I it was inspired by how I come from a background of like photojournalism, so I felt very comfortable like photographing things that had very little to do with me. And I found that what I struggled with the most was actually photographing people closest to me. Like I felt the sense of like when there was intimacy, it was very hard for me to capture. So I was like, okay, I'm going to challenge myself to go into my friends' homes and like the people and places that I spend the most time in and find a way to like photograph that would be like maybe objectively good. Objective. But as I started doing that, I realized that, you know, a lot of the people that I chose to photograph were my Vietnamese friends who've also were all like born in Vietnam and moved abroad. So we had very similar experiences, but all of their homes looked very different, and the ways that people choose to express parts of their culture can be very different. But what tied it all together is that no matter who it was, is like people still try to like bring their cultural identity into their lives and their homes, even being so far away from home. And that was what inspired me to make the Kitchen God series. It's the idea that I think our generation, we're very much of the mindset of like, we want to make our own paths and like we are our own people. But I was very intrigued by why we cared so much to carry our cultural identity with us. And if you think about like the narrative of like Vietnamese immigration in the US, it was so much of like a forced immigration, whereas what contrasted with like what I was seeing was like we in a way like chose to move abroad. And so in choosing to do that, we care a lot more about how we can carry on our cultural traditions and rituals, but in our own ways. So I think, again, like what we were saying about community, it's like, I found that this was like trait of the community that, maybe people don't even notice that they're doing, that we still care to like bring parts of our culture into our homes. And that I think is what ties together like this idea of community and care. I really recently was reflecting on this, and I remember kind of like the lessons I would learn or the kind of images I would see when you're in journalism school, the things that people consider really important and like hard hitting. And it was almost always images of the Vietnam War or like the US war in Vietnam. And I was looking at some of that recently and I didn't realize like how much it impacted me that like, when you're in journalism, you have this idea of like you have to get closer to the objective truth and that as a photojournalist, you have to try to not insert your own opinions into things, which is almost impossible to do in anything that you do. Like whatever comes out of you is like your own opinion, keeping in mind this like photographic history of how Vietnam has been portrayed, the Vietnamese people, and this idea of like how photography is almost like it's very aggressive. I think it's like anytime you photograph, you're putting the person in front of the camera as like a subject, like even the words that people use around it, like shoot, like subjects, like it's very aggressive. And I think that our generation now, especially people who are have come from like multiple cultures, we are a lot more aware of, how we have been subjected to these visual stereotypes or like the history of what like our cultures look like. And we're very much actively like countering that. So I think I'm just like one part of like so many photographers, especially who are doing this and very actively like viewing photography as a performance and like every photo is a performance and every photo has so much of your opinion in it. And so for me, it's like important to just like lean into that completely.